I don't know if that's going to stop the algal blooms in South Australia, but it seems unlikely that a 0.0001 degrees Celsius change in the temperature is going to have a material impact on any of us. But yet that is what, that was the premise of the whole contribution of Senator Hanson-Young. She is promising her people, the Australian people, that if we stop this one project, then the weather will change in this country. That is completely and utterly absurd. And it treats the Australian people like morons. They're not. And Senator Hanson-Young was saying, we're all stupid. No, I'm with stupid. I'm with stupid in this chamber. It is completely stupid here to sit here and say that stopping one project is going to have a material impact on the world's climate or weather. But that's what this whole bill is trying to do. So it should be rejected on that basis alone. We know that this is inconsistent with the original objects of the bill of the EPBC Act, which has been around for a long time.
Look, I'm going to be completely straight with you here. The numbers don't lie, and honestly, neither should we. So let's talk about what's actually happening with Australia's emissions, because according to Senator Matt Canavan, we've been sold a story that just doesn't match reality. And before anyone accuses me of being political, I'm just reading you the government's own data from their own website. That's not opinion, that's just facts. So Canavan stands up in Parliament and he's basically saying, hang on a minute, Senator Grogan just told us emissions are going down under this Labour government. But when you actually check the Department of Environment's website, when you look at the official greenhouse gas accounts, emissions have gone up. They've literally increased. In 2021, when Labour took power, Australia was emitting 440 million tons of carbon per year. By 2023, the most recent data available, we're at 453 million tons. That's an increase of 13 million tons annually. So the entire premise that emissions are dropping under this government, according to their own numbers, that's just not true. Now, Canavan does acknowledge that if you zoom out further, Australia's overall emissions have decreased since the mid-2000s. Back in 2005, which was the baseline year set under the Kyoto Protocol, we were emitting 601 million tons annually. So yes, we've come down from that. We've reduced by roughly 160 million tons per year. But here's where it gets interesting, and honestly a bit controversial. Almost all of that reduction, about 150 million tons out of that 160 million ton drop, has come from one category called land use change. What does that actually mean? It means state governments put massive restrictions on farmers being able to clear their own land. And through the way carbon accounting works, because we're not clearing as much land as we used to, we get to count that as a credit as reducing emissions. Canavan calls the carbon accounting schemes pretty dodgy, and you can see why he'd say that. It's not like we've fundamentally transformed our energy system or industrial processes. We've just told farmers they can't develop their own property as freely, and then we count that as environmental progress. But let's get to the actual bill being debated, because Canavan agrees with the Greens on one thing. This legislation isn't going to achieve what it's supposed to achieve. The bill would amend environmental law to assess carbon emission impacts on a project-by-project basis. So when a new project comes forward for approval under the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the government would have to consider its individual climate impact. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young from the Greens is behind this bill, and she's argued that stopping individual projects, like the Northwest Shelf Gas Project, would help stop things like algae blooms in South Australia and would change the weather in this country. Canavan breaks down the mathematics of this, and this is where it gets pretty stark. The Northwest Shelf Project, which the government has conditionally approved, would have scope 1 and 2 emissions of about 8 million tons of carbon per year. Some estimates are lower, but let's use the higher figure. If you plug that into the IPCC formulas, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change formulas that calculate the relationship between carbon emissions and global temperature, stopping the Northwest Shelf Project would lower global temperatures by 0.001 of a degree Celsius. That's not a typo, that's 100,000th of a degree. So Canavan's asking a pretty reasonable question. Is that tiny infinitesimal change in global temperature going to stop algae blooms in South Australia? Is it going to materially impact the climate or weather that Australians experience? His argument is that it's absurd to promise people that stopping one project will change the weather in this country, and that treating Australians like they're too stupid to understand these numbers is insulting. Whether one project moves forward or not, the impact on global climate is essentially unmeasurable. He points out this was never what the EPBC Act was designed to do. When the act was introduced, the second reading speech by then Senator Robert Hill specifically said that while they needed good environmental law, tackling greenhouse gas emissions would be achieved through separate policy through a $180 million program announced at that time. The clear intent was that this particular piece of legislation wasn't the vehicle for addressing climate change. It was about protecting endangered species, managing water resources, heritage sites, that sort of environmental protection. Adding climate assessment to it on a project-by-project basis was never the original framework. Now, the broader argument being made by the Greens and others is that the rest of the world is acting on climate change, and Australia is being left behind if we don't pass bills like this. Canavan challenges that premise pretty directly with recent data. There's something called the Statistical Review of World Energy, which is now run by the Energy Institute. It's widely regarded as the most comprehensive source of global energy data. This review released data a few weeks ago, showing what's happened since the world signed up to net zero emissions at the Glasgow Climate Conference in late 2021. You'd think that after every country pledged to reach net zero, global emissions would be dropping, right? Here's what actually happened. Since 2021, global carbon emissions have increased by 1.7 billion tons per year. Every single year, the world is emitting 1.7 billion tons more than it was. To put that in perspective, Australia's total annual emissions are about 450 million tons. So in just 3 years, the world has increased its emissions by more than 3 times Australia's entire annual output. That's a pretty inconvenient fact when people are claiming the world is taking serious action on climate change. If everyone's supposedly acting, why are global emissions going up by nearly 2 billion tons annually? Canavan argues that the evidence shows countries are continuing to prioritize energy access and economic development, particularly for their poorer citizens who don't have reliable 24-hour electricity access like we do in Australia. And you can see this in the coal data. We're constantly told that coal is dying, that no one wants to buy our coal anymore, that the industry is on its way out. But that same Energy Institute data shows that since net zero was agreed to by the world, global coal mining has increased by 1.2 billion tons per year. Again, to put that in context, Australia mines and exports roughly 450 million tons of coal annually. The global increase has been more than double our entire production in just 3 years. Let's break down which countries are driving this increase, because it's pretty revealing. Mongolia has increased coal mining by 74 million tons per year since net zero came into effect. Remember the Adani Carmichael coal mine? That was the controversial project in Queensland that produced about 10 million tons per year and dominated headlines for years. Mongolia has basically opened 7 Adani-sized mines. Indonesia increased coal mining by 222 million tons annually. That's 22 Adanis. Did you see that covered on the front pages? Did anyone chain themselves to Indonesian bulldozers? India has increased coal mining by 273 million tons per year. That's 27 Adanis. In China increased coal production by 654 million tons annually. That's 65 Adani Carmichael coal mines opening in just 3 years. China now produces almost 6 billion tons of coal per year. Canavan makes a pretty biting observation here. He says he has to respect Chinese government officials for keeping a straight face when they talk to us about green steel and reducing emissions, while they're simultaneously opening the equivalent of 65 major coal mines. When the Prime Minister meets with Chinese officials, does he bring up the fact that they've increased coal mining by 654 million tons? If he really cared about global climate change, wouldn't that be the first topic of conversation? Meanwhile, Australia has signed up to net zero. We have reduced our emissions if you count the land clearing restrictions, but we've destroyed our energy grid in the process. Since we signed up to net zero, electricity prices are up 30%, and that's after enormous government subsidies that are ending soon. Gas is up 39% in price. That's why households and businesses are struggling, and we're losing our industries while other countries expand theirs. Take Indonesia as an example. Why has Indonesia increased its coal mining so dramatically? A big reason is to fuel about 20 new coal-fired power stations they've built in the last 3 years. 20 new coal plants. That's more than we have operating in the entire country. And what are they using all that cheap coal power for? Nickel smelting. Indonesia has massively expanded its nickel processing industry. There was actually a good documentary about this on Channel 7 recently, and the effect of Indonesia's expansion has been the shutdown of Australia's nickel refineries and smelters. We've lost the nickel industry except for a couple of mines. We've lost 10,000 jobs because of this, and it barely gets mentioned in the climate debate. The pattern is pretty clear. We make energy more expensive in the name of climate action. Other countries keep energy cheap using coal and gas. Industries that need affordable, reliable power move from Australia to those countries. We lose jobs, they gain jobs. Our emissions technically drop because we're doing less industrial production. Their emissions go up because they're doing more. But globally, total emissions increase. Everyone congratulates us on our commitments while we deindustrialize. Canavan brings up something interesting that happened just yesterday. The Governor General gave a speech outlining the government's agenda, and Canavan noticed something missing. There was not a single mention that the Labour Party would lower electricity prices. Not one word about making power more affordable. Compare that to 2022, when the then Governor General David Hurley, reading on behalf of the newly elected Labour government, promised they would help families and businesses save hundreds of dollars per year on their electricity bills. That was the explicit promise. Did that happen? No. Electricity bills went up, and now they're not even pretending they'll lower prices. They've basically given up, raised the white flag on the cost of living crisis that's hitting Australians hard. They'll talk about clean energy, about renewables, about being green, but they won't talk about why you're paying $1,000 more per year for your power. They won't explain why Australia can't have the same competitive energy prices as other countries. This is the fundamental tension in all of this. The Greens want to block individual projects based on their climate impact, even when that impact is unmeasurably small on a global scale. The Labour government wants credit for climate action even though emissions under their watch have gone up. Meanwhile, electricity prices have skyrocketed, making life harder for ordinary Australians and making our industries globally uncompetitive. And all of this is happening while the rest of the world, particularly major economies like China, India, and Indonesia, are increasing their emissions and coal consumption dramatically, building the very industries we're shutting down here. Canavan's argument is that we're being asked to sacrifice our economic competitiveness, our affordable energy, and our industrial jobs for a negligible impact on global emissions. The Northwest Shelf Project is a perfect example. 8 million tons of emissions per year sounds like a lot until you realize China increased its coal mining alone by 654 million tons annually in just 3 years. One Australian gas project is a rounding error in the context of global emissions trends. Yet the Greens want to block it, promise that stopping it will change Australia's weather, change our climate. Canavan's saying that's not just wrong, it's insulting to Australians' intelligence. The deeper issue is about honesty in the climate debate. If the goal is genuinely to reduce global emissions, then you have to deal with the fact that global emissions are going up, not down. You have to address the fact that the world's largest emitters are dramatically increasing coal production and usage. You can't just look at what's happening in Australia or other Western countries in isolation, declare victory because our emissions dropped, and ignore that those emissions often just shifted to other countries along with the industries and jobs. That's not environmental progress. That's just accounting tricks and deindustrialization dressed up as climate leadership. And if the goal is to make life more affordable for Australians, to keep energy costs down so businesses can compete and households can make ends meet, then you have to be honest about the fact that current policies have made electricity 30% more expensive and gas 39% more expensive. You can't promise cheaper power in one election and then go silent on the issue in the next when you've completely failed to deliver. What Canavan is really asking for is some basic honesty and consistency. If you're going to claim you're reducing emissions, use accurate data. If you're going to promise cheaper power, deliver it or admit you can't. If you're going to say the world is acting on climate change, acknowledge that global emissions and coal use are actually increasing substantially. If you're going to block projects for climate reasons, be honest about the actual measurable impact of those decisions rather than making grandiose claims about changing the weather. The current approach seems to be making Australians poorer through higher energy costs, making our industries less competitive so they shut down or move offshore, achieving minimal actual reduction in global emissions because other countries are increasing their emissions faster than we're decreasing ours, and then claiming it's all necessary climate action that the rest of the world is doing too. Canavan's pointing out that narrative doesn't match reality. The numbers tell a very different story. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, the data he's citing comes from official government sources and internationally recognized statistical reviews. Australia's emissions did go up under the current government according to their own accounts. Global emissions have increased since net zero commitments were made. Coal mining and coal-fired power generation have expanded dramatically in major economies. Electricity prices in Australia have risen sharply. These aren't opinions or partisan talking points, they're measurements. The question becomes, what do we do with that information? Do we keep pursuing policies that make energy more expensive here while having negligible impact on global emissions? Do we block individual projects that will reduce global temperatures by unmeasurably small amounts? Do we continue telling Australians that we're climate leaders while emissions go up and industries leave? Or do we take a more realistic approach that acknowledges our limited impact on global climate while trying to maintain affordable energy and competitive industries? That's really what this debate is about. Not just one bill about environmental approval processes, but the entire framework of how Australia approaches climate policy, energy policy, and economic policy, and whether the promises being made to Australians match the outcomes being delivered. Right now, according to the data Canavan presented, there's a pretty significant gap between the rhetoric and the reality.